recording, please. Come on. All right. Machine is working. Yay, machine. All right. So we are going to look at a dark corner of the text. We are in Parashat Noach, for those of you keeping score, which you all should be. And a reminder, as always, that when reading through the weekly parashah, we here do not read through the whole weekly parashah, but you should be. You should be reviewing the entire text, preferably before Wednesday, because it's nice to have a full view of what the entire Torah portion is about, and then you can take bets on what I'm going to pick. But we only have a chance to look at certain things, and it's always tempting, and I've done a number of times in past years, to look at the Noah narrative in and of itself, look also at the wonderful story of the Tower of Babel and all of that. But there's one part that I have not done, and we're going to take it on today, and I may end up having to do a second version some other time to do it real justice. But we're going to look at a part of the story of Noah that no one ever wants to talk about, except for those that do, and then use it to justify civil war. This is actually an incredibly powerful historical piece that has fallen much out of favor for discussion in the modern world, but I think it does need to be looked at. You can say this is sort of one of the dark corners of the story, and we'll see what we can do with it. With that as a tantalizing preview, we are on page 52, chapter 9 in the book of Genesis, obviously, and we're going to pick up with verse 18, which is the sixth aliyah, if you're reading in the Torah breakdown. So the Torah itself agrees that this is a unit, or rather the Jewish tradition agrees this is a unit. So we are on chapter 9, verse 18, page 52, right-hand side. Everyone.
Done with Noah and the ark.
So, sorry. The story so far, right? Previously on the story of Noah. So, what's that? Yeah. So previously, yes, we had the world being corrupt. The world was wiped out, but not before Noah and his family, extended family, got onto the ark along with a bunch of animals, and they have been floating around. And it's about a year later, they finally get off the ark. The animals are being set out, and what's going to happen? Well, the rainbow happened just previously in chapter 9. And little Jewish trivia, the rainbow was actually considered to be an ill omen in Jewish tradition. We do say a blessing for it, but the blessing is basically, thank God that God still remembers his covenant and isn't wiping us out. Because if you see a rainbow, it means God needed the reminder. Because God would have wiped us out if he had not promised already to not wipe us out. So, yeah. We came close. There's a saying that when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was alive, there was never a rainbow in his lifetime. Which is an interesting way of saying he was so good and righteous and amazing that as long as he was alive, God never once thought about wiping out the earth.
People did need to be reminded.
When he died, then God went, well, now that he's not here. No, I can't. I promised I wouldn't. Et cetera, et cetera. All right. Okay. Again, God's more complicated than that, but it's an interesting way of looking at rainbows. It will change the way you look at them. But all of that has happened, and now it is time for life to begin again. And so we're going to see exactly what's going to happen with Noah and his family as they trundle off the ark. We all good? Caught up with the story, more or less?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you mind still reading?
Okay. That would be 18.
I do have to warn you now, our volunteer for today is going to have to be reading something disturbing later in the commentary.
Oh, no.
So when you volunteer for one, you're volunteering for both.
Okay, thanks for the warning.
Okay.
The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham being the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these, the whole world branched out.
All right, so anything interesting to notice here?
That they named Ham as being the father of Canaan, but not the other.
Okay, so we're mentioning one of the grandkids of Noah, but we're not mentioning any of the others. Right. So that already should be piquing our interest of why are we mentioning Canaan, but not mentioning any of the other kids that came from these three guys. So the overall structure of it, though, makes sense, right? If Noah and his sons were there, then obviously the world comes from them. This is the second time when the world has been born from one family.
May I assume there were some daughters as well?
Well, there were daughter-in-laws. That is to say, Noah's sons had wives.
From where?
No, they came on the ark with them. They came on the ark with them. But we do not have any record of Noah having daughters. And we also don't have any record before this of the son's children. So this is the first time we've actually heard about their having kids.
Noah, the tiller of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself within his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a cloth, placed it against both their backs, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way, so they did not see their father's nakedness.
All right, we're going to pause there. Let's make sure we understand what happened. And if you think you know what happened, trust me, you don't know what happened. Okay, so the basic text seems to be saying that Noah did what? He became a farmer, right? He started working the earth, which is a way of getting back to this idea of Adamah, right? He's back in the soil.
Right.
And he is planting a vineyard. Interesting choice of crop. Whether this was his only crop or not, it doesn't seem to be the main issue. And then he gets drunk. Now, how long does it take to make wine? Yeah, a while, right? So
That's right.
are we seeing a sped up time cycle here? Or are we seeing a condensed wine process here? It's a little unclear exactly. Is this a montage that's covering a little while? Or is this something that's happening very quickly? But the part that becomes most shocking, of course, is that his son, Ham, who remember is an adult. It's always tempting to think of, whenever it says the sons of Noah, that we've got three little boys over here. Right? We're talking about full-grown men here who are married. His son, Ham, notices that his father has gone into a drunken stupor with sort of robe open or whatever you want to call it in the tent. He goes in. He sees it. He comes out and tells his brothers. The brothers go, oh dear. They take a cloth. They back into the tent. They drop it over their father so that no one is going to see that he is splayed out that way. And that's the end of the story. Not quite. All right. But everyone understand what the basic text seems to be implying on a surface read? Yes? Good. All right. By the way, this is the part that doesn't make it into the animated version of Noah's Ark.
Oh, yes.
Right. It's never in there.
Now, it always finishes at the rainbow, and then they say, and that's all that happened. They lived happily ever after. And this is, like I said, one of the parts that gets ignored from the text. But we're not ignoring it, even if we might want to. Onward.
When Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. And he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be a slave to them. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave to them. Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah came to 950 years, then he died.
Okay.
Wow.
What?
Yeah.
So he woke up. He then knew what his son had done. His younger son had done. It says knew rather than. How do you know
Yeah,
what
I
happened?
know.
Right? Exactly. You're drunk. You're passed out. You wake up with a blanket on you, and you immediately think something happened.
And you blame
And who's talking about it? Right? So
the father.
what's that?
But Ham is talking about it. What does Canaan do?
Ah, okay. Cursed be Canaan.
Yeah.
Who saw Noah naked?
Huh.
Ham, his dad.
And he told.
And he told
And Ham is the one who told. So why is Canaan being the one cursed?
he must have
Right.
told other people. He was
No.
the
Did
mean
he?
What?
We didn't see Canaan do anything.
Nothing.
No.
We only see him get punished.
Unless if you want to punish somebody, you say, may your children be in misery. Your children be like that.
Certainly that is a
Yeah.
horrible thing to say.
Yes.
But that seems out of place. I mean, usually you would curse the person who did the deed
Right.
and also maybe curse their kids if you were going to,
Right.
continue to be, even more mean-spirited. But this just says cursed be Canaan. It doesn't say cursed be Ham at all, which is ironic because this passage has become known as the curse of Ham. That's how, obviously the name is actually Ham, but if you look it up, you'll see it as looking like it's saying the curse of Ham,
Okay.
which is not about keeping kosher.
No.
The curse of Ham is the title. Really, this is like in quotes because it has been used for about 400 years or so to justify slavery. And by slavery, I mean the African slave trade.
Right.
The curse of Ham has been used to justify the African slave trade. And there were people, especially in the United States, and we're going to read one, who, based off this concept, said that it was our biblical duty to enslave Africans.
Yeah.
Right? That it was our duty to do so.
Wow.
And it is, yes. Like,
This is what
what?
this is what was taught at Southern Christian seminaries for a good 100 years.
And this was forever we were going to enslave them.
This-
There was
Okay,
no
well, we're
end-
going to see. I have a small
Prior to the
excerpt,
Civil
and you can
War,
look up.
this is what started.
Right. So prior to the Civil War, indeed, I'm going to show you an excerpt from 1860 from a Presbyterian minister, one of the most famous of these preachers on this particular topic. He leaves open in the extended version of the sermon, and if you ever think my sermons are long, his was like 13 pages and like 10-point font. He leaves open the possibility that maybe there might be some miraculous change to their race. But basically, no one should think that this is going away, and no one should think that it is immoral, because God himself said we should have these people as slaves. Now, you're already beginning to see some of the problems with this, right? If you say the curse is the curse of Ham, what's the immediate problem? Who got cursed?
Curse.
All right. The first thing is the actual curse should have been called the curse of Canaan, right? Or the curse of Canaan, if you were going to use American pronunciation. Why would those who were using this as proponents of slavery not call it the curse of Canaan? What continent is Canaan in?
Asia.
Asia. Right? This is the land of Israel as far as like territorial space goes. Right? That if you were to point to a map in the ancient world of the land of Canaan, or if you were to point to a map of Canaan in 1850s, you'd be pointing to a map of Israel. You'd be pointing to that spot. That wasn't where the slaves were taken from. Also, what color were the Canaanites?
Wrong.
Why?
Probably what you would notice now if you were to go to the modern Middle East, right? And you would see, a various Semitic-ish type, whether it be somewhere between, Arabian or Egyptian or some mix or blend. Yeah, something on that brownish spectrum of the Semitic skin type, especially when you're all farmers and you're outside all the time. You don't get a lot of people who are under shelter and away from UV, no SPF anything. If it's SPF, I need to work to live. So obviously, we've already got one shift by going the curse of Ham becomes the curse of Canaan. But you can see why it would be the curse of Ham, because Ham's the one who actually did something. So there's a certain understanding there. If we were to have time to go on further into the curse of into the rest of the text, we would find out who Ham's children are besides Canaan. Right? If you look just over on page 6. Sorry, verse 6, page 55. Yes, verse 6 of chapter 10. The descendants of Ham were Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Okay, so pause for a second here. Well, Canaan, we all know, right? The Canaanites, so famous throughout the rest of the Tanakh. Do we know the Putim?
The foot?
No, that's actually one of those territorial areas that there's not 100% agreement of exactly who they were. The other two, on the other hand, we do know. Mitzrayim, you should all know.
Right.
Egypt. And yes, for some unknown reason, the translator decided to not translate the word Mitzrayim in this passage, but did translate the word Mitzrayim in every other passage in the Bible. Right? So that you don't realize that it's talking that Egypt is the descendant of Ham. Right? The Egyptians were descendants of Ham.
Right.
And and as were the Canaanites, which also is an underscore of why there was a rivalry between the children of Shem, which is eventually us, and the children of Ham, the Egyptians and the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians and the Canaanites, who were our biggest challenges for the early part of our formation. And then we have one more country, Cush.
Yes.
Where's Kush?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia is generally that area of Africa is considered to be Kush, and that's most famous for most people from the first line of the Megillat Esther, the story of Esther, because it says that Ahasuerus, the emperor of Persia, ruled from Hodu ad Kush, right, from India to Ethiopia, which is a really large empire.
Or Miriam slandering Moses, that Cushite woman.
And
Yes.
slandering or complimenting, depending upon how you want to read the interpretation there. But yes,
Pointed it out.
but Kush is definitely used in that context as well. So if we were going to be talking about Africans as part of the slave trade,
Right.
who would we think would be the more logical target of the in quote curse?
Push.
Kush. They're the only, as far as we know, black people, if you want to use the term, among them, right? If you were going to talk about actual dark skin, African people who were likely to be taken as slaves, you'd be talking about the Kushim, right?
That's
You'd be,
not where the slave trade came
which isn't historically where the slave trade came from,
And it's-
right? Because the Ethiopians are on the wrong side of the African continent for where the majority of slaves were taken when they were being taken by the slavers of Europe. So it all doesn't really work.
No.
And yet it made perfect sense to millions of people of why this would justify the acts that they were doing. And not only justify them as saying it's okay, but saying it's deserved.
It's necessary.
It's proper, right? This idea of the curse of Ham, which, as we say, is a complete misnomer, as being the appropriate, as saying that the appropriate relationship between Europeans and Africans should be slavery, is this pernicious misunderstanding of the text that just became embedded within so many people's psyche. It has been mostly expunged, at least overtly, by many people, but it still nonetheless clings. And we're going to read some excerpts from Benjamin Palmer giving his sermon in November 29, 1860. We're on the But Today. And like I said, I did have to heavily excerpt from this full sermon because the full sermon is much, much longer. But he is essentially in this sermon trying to justify the Civil War from the South's point of view, about why the South is going to fight, why it is necessary for them to fight, why it is necessary for them to stand up and risk their lives, even if they think they're going to lose, against the North. And we'll see what his justifications for the Civil War were. Spoiler alert, he never says the phrase states' rights. Just want to let you know, he never talks about states' rights as being the justification for the Civil War. All right. Again, I apologize for making you read this, but this is what we got.
But today, burdened hearts all over this land are brought to the sanctuary of God. We, quote, see the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian do tremble. That's the end of that quote. We have fallen upon times when there are, and I quote, signs in the sun and in the moon and stars upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexities. The sea and the waves are roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming in the near yet gloomy future.
All right. Or as you might say, the times are troubled. Right?
Is he quoting from the Bible?
Yes. So he's quoting, saying the times are troubled, just like in the past. People don't know what to do. I'm going to tell you what's coming. I'm going to tell you what to make of all of this, and I'm going to tell you what we should be doing. By the way, there was no such thing as a 501(c) status back then. Preachers were absolutely allowed and expected to talk on political issues. So if this is a little different than what you might expect to hear nowadays, don't be surprised. All right. So what's the problem, and what are we going to do about this?
Well, a nation often has a character as well-defined and intense as that of an individual. This depends, of course, upon a variety of causes operating through a long period of time. It is due largely to the original traits which distinguish the stock from which it springs, and to the providential training which has formed its education.
All right, so let's just make sure we pull a few pieces apart here so that we understand what he's talking about. So the first thing is he's saying nations have a character, just like people have character, right? There's a personality to a person, there's a personality to a nation. And the personality to a person is to a nation is based upon the stock from which it comes. What does he mean by stock? People, livestock, your genetics, right? Where are you from, right? It's your stock is your race and your nationality from which you were drawn from. But since most nations, unlike the United States, had only their own stock, they thought, he's really talking more about sort of a racial understanding of what people are. But there is also providential training. Now, providential training here, what he's basically saying is that this is, he's sort of saying the nature and nurture, but he's saying the nurture is godly directed. By his use of the word providence throughout his writings, what he's really saying is this is what God has ordained would be the way that this nation would rise to be its current character. That this is not an accident, this is not random, and certainly this is not wrong, that this is the way God has wanted things to play out. We still following so far? Yeah, I apologize for 19th century writing styles, but it's what we got.
If then the South is such a people,
Right.
What?
Okay, so if we're a nation, what do we do?
yeah, what at this juncture is their providential trust?
What does God expect of us?
I answer that it is to conserve and to perpetuate the institution of domestic slavery as now existing.
Right. So what is the cause that makes the South the South?
That's wow.
Slavery.
Slavery.
Right. That is what God is calling upon them to do. Right? God wants them to defend slavery because that is their lot in life. That is what they have been groomed to do by God, so that there would be this nation to defend God's institution of slavery.
It is just this impertinence of human legislation which sets bounds to what God alone can regulate that the South is called this day to resent and resist.
Right. So the audacity, the chutzpah, well, he wouldn't have used that term,
Yeah, right.
the human presumption to pass laws which would contradict God's laws, because the North and many other people wanted to pass laws that would say no more slavery. How dare they try to overturn what God has ordained, is what he is saying. God wants there to be slaves, and there are people trying to stop us from having slaves. They are making laws that go against God's law. It'd be the same as if someone were saying it's now legal to murder. That's what he believes. We still following? And not agreeing, obviously, but understanding what he's saying. Okay, onward.
Yeah, wow. This duty is bound upon us again as the constituted guardians of the slaves themselves. Our lot is not more implicated in theirs than their lot in ours. And in our mutual relations, we survive or perish together.
All right, so he is trying to make sure that you understand. He's not saying we should have slaves because we want them. We have slaves because that's what we are supposed to do. Right? The same way, if you look back in chapter 9, that God said that Canaan would be a slave to his brothers, that means his brothers have a duty to be a master to him. Right? So therefore, both sides are bound by this, right?
Impeccable logic.
Right? They have a duty to be slaves to us. We have a duty to be a master to them, and we cannot set down our duty any more than they can set down theirs. Yeah, very tidy.
Yeah.
It's convenient, of course, that he happens to be on the master side, but
Yeah, that's right.
I don't think you found many slaves arguing from this position.
The worst foes of the black race are those who have intermeddled on their behalf.
I did look up intermeddle is not a word that still gets used, but he's basically saying the people who have made the most trouble for blacks aren't the blacks, they are the do-gooders that come from the North, right? That are trying to change God's order of things. Those are the problem. Those are the troublemakers, and they're only hurting the blacks, right? They're hurting the blacks more than we ever could, right? Despite the whippings, beatings, murders. Okay, onwards.
We know better than others that every attribute of their character fits them for dependence and servitude.
Right, this is their nature to be slaves.
Yeah.
So and we know that best because we have more of them around us than the others do. So it's just obvious that this is their God-ordained place in the world.
But they are by nature the most affectionate and loyal of all races beneath the sun. They are also the most helpless. And no calamity can befall them greater than the loss of that protection that they enjoy under this patriarchal system.
Right? So the worst thing that could happen to them would be to set them free.
Right.
right? Because they are happy and they are affectionate and they are loyal, just like a golden retriever. And what you wouldn't want to do to a domesticated dog would just be to let it go wild, right? That would be terrible for the dog. So too for these. Right? That is his perspective, is that God made them like this, and there's nothing wrong with them being like that. They're happy and nice, although he also calls them incredibly lazy in other passages. But you wouldn't want to hurt them by giving them their freedom.
No, because you're protecting them.
Exactly. You have to take care of them. It is your burden. Yeah, it's amazing the way people do this act of self-deception.
Their residence here, in the presence of the vigorous Saxon race, would be but the signal for their rapid extermination before they had time to waste away through listlessness, filth, and vice.
All right, so in the ellipse that I cut out there, he says, what do people want to do with them? Right? They want to free them. Are they going to send them all back to Africa? They don't starve to death because, they're lazy and not very good farmers, and, it just wouldn't work. Then there'd be disease. And then he argues, well, you want to just leave them here free? How could they possibly compete against us, the Saxon race, right? They would surely suffer if they had to compete on a level playing field against us. Because after all, despite being affectionate, loyal, and happy, they are also listless, filthy, and full of vice, which is kind of an interesting combination. Yeah, that's certainly not the way I would describe a golden retriever. So he wants to have it both ways. They are these wonderful people that we're just taking care of because we're just that noble. And they're also horrible and not suited because they would just be terrible if they were left on their own. So what would happen with freedom?
Freedom would be their doom. And equally from both, they call upon us, their providential guardians, to be protected.
They want to be our slaves. Right? And again, he has in much longer passages, which I couldn't find a suitable condensed quote, going over and over again this idea that this all goes all the way back to the story of Noah.
Yeah.
Right? It's just obvious. Open your Bible, chapter 9, and you understand they need to be our slaves. Right? And that we need to be their protectors. And that they want it that way. Now, why do they kept trying to escape? Well, his argument was that was because you had people coming intermeddling. Right? That would keep trying to fill their head with foolish ideas. But if you just left them on their own, it would all fit together perfectly as God intended. Onward.
Last of all, in this great struggle, we defend the cause of God and religion. The abolition spirit is undeniably atheistic.
All right, so one of the more shocking phrases from him, and he had plenty, is the idea that all people should be allowed to be free is an atheist idea. And again, he is grounding this through his reading of the story of Noah. Because if God wants these people to be slaves, if you don't want them to be slaves, you don't want what God wants, which means you are not trying to serve God. Right? The logic is impeccable, if absolutely flawed, by its axiom to begin with. So yes, he is basically saying, if you want to free the slaves, that means you're an atheist, which even to this day is still considered to be a major issue. That there are many polls that will find people who are likely to be elected to office, atheists are near the bottom of those polls in most parts of this country. They are still looked upon with deep, deep suspicion. And in the 19th century, calling someone an atheist was like tantamount to calling them just a devil. So yeah, this is a major statement that he's trying to make. Onward.
Yeah.
Spit it out.
Did you find a flaw with this?
Spit it out.
Wasn't God that cursed?
I'm sorry, what?
It wasn't God that cursed.
So I wasn't sure whether anyone was going to pick this up on it. So I was waiting to see whether whether anyone would make this point. Thank you very much for getting there.
Good.
Who cursed Canaan?
Noah.
Noah. Did God say this was his curse?
No.
Did God tell Noah to curse his son?
No.
No. Nowhere does it say that God approves of this curse. And I'll be honest with you, there are plenty of people cursing lots of people throughout the whole rest of the Tanakh. That doesn't mean God should be blamed as being behind all of those curses, right? When Saul curses his son, Jonathan, that doesn't mean God said, yeah, that's right, you curse him. It means Saul was going nuts. So similarly here, yes, Noah seems to be flying off the deep end and getting upset about all of this. it does not appear that God is ratifying what Noah is upset about. Now, we are going to see some rabbinic texts which will put into context perhaps what Ham actually did and what Canaan actually did. And then we will see some rabbinic texts that do try to imply that there were real-world repercussions from what happened here. But whether or not this curse was God's curse or not should be question number one. And certainly the fact that there is any ambiguity should mean that this whole idea of the curse of Ham being used to justify slavery should never have even gotten off the floor.
Right.
If you'd been back there in the 1800s, well, we never would have met, but they probably still wouldn't have asked you for that, to clarify that point. You would have been taken outside.
Terminated.
Well, yes, because he's an atheist, clearly, by daring to remind them what the text of God says. But yes, that would have been a good point to raise. But this was an argument that came after the institution had already been established. This was not the argument that established the institution.
Right. The argument about slavery, then, which sweeps over the entire circle of our relations, 4 cardinal points of duty to ourselves, to the world, and to Almighty God. It establishes the nature and solemnity of our present trust to preserve and transmit our existing system of domestic servitude, with the right, unchallenged by man, to go and root itself wherever providence and nature may carry it.
Those of you who remember from your history classes may understand what he means by that. Having the right to go wherever it can be established was the major discussion that led to the Civil War. Was not that the North wanted the South to abolish their slavery, was that the North did not want new states to come into the Union as slave states. So what he's basically saying is God wants us to be able to have slaves in any state that we want. And for the government to try and tell us that we're not allowed to have slaves wherever we want in any new states, that is tantamount to rebellion against God.
And only because it's your brother's birthday here, Kate. This was a Thanksgiving sermon?
Absolutely.
Right after Lincoln got elected.
Yes. It was,
Right, I mean, so
Weeks
this,
after Lincoln was
Right.
elected.
and actually in the rest of the sermon,
So
he goes into great detail about what's wrong with Lincoln. So
Oh, wow.
I mean,
Wow.
wow.
yeah, if you want to see a little bit more of what were people at the time of the Civil War saying, was their justification for the Civil War, I highly recommend reading his whole sermon.
He's
It's-
not the only one.
No, he's definitely not the only one, but this
So
is
I'm only
an
thinking
easy
this
source.
must be calm next to, because it's Thanksgiving.
No, they all spoke calmly.
They-
The writing was all 19th century genteel.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure out in the streets they were shouting and yelling, but the things that got published were all very calm and well-reasoned and well-argued and with great vocabulary.
Lots of biblical quotes
Exactly.
thrown in, sprinkled in to make
So
the air
The calmness of his structure is not unusual, and the content is not unusual for that time and place. All right, so
What's going on?
I just want to make sure that you understand that if we neglect to read portions of our Torah, if we neglect to study portions of our Torah, others will claim that territory for us, and they will decide what it means. Because for about 400 years, when someone said the curse of Ham, this is what they meant. Whether they were for or against it, they did believe that God had condemned Ham, Canaan, Cush, somebody in Africa to being slaves. And therefore the question wasn't, is that what God said? The question was, how do we deal with that now? And even among some of the abolitionists, they believed that the curse of Noah was the real curse, but that we could move on, that we could change, that we could help them adapt and become better than the curse. They still accepted the curse as being square one. So this really did dominate the conversation within many people who were not necessarily preachers when they tried to understand this concept of whether or not having slaves was a bad thing. All right, so let's see how our own sages, who predate this by a little bit, answered some of these same questions. All right, so now we're at the bottom, and Ham is the father of Canaan. You may remember was the first line that we began with in our study today.
Okay, and this is Rashi saying,
Yes,
why is it necessary to mention this here?
which you guys all pointed out. Wait, why are we talking about one of the grandkids?
Because this section goes on to deal with the account of Noah's drunkenness when Ham sinned, and through him, Canaan was cursed. Now, as the generations of Ham have not yet been mentioned, and we therefore would not know that Canaan was his son, it was necessary to state here that Ham is the father.
All right, so Rashi's giving us a couple pieces of very important information. One, he's saying, look, by the end of this story, in chapter, 25, we're going to get cursed is Canaan. If we don't introduce the character, by the time we get to verse 25 isn't going to make any sense. Because the reader who's reading this for the first time, not for the 3,000th time, is going to go, who's Canaan? Who's this person? Where did he come from? Which, by the way, is exactly what we should have been noticing when we first read through it, which was, if Ham did the sin, why is the name Canaan being brought up? And Rashi is trying to say that, yes, an astute reader would have noticed that, and therefore the Torah had to mention us the family relationship before we got there. Part two that he's getting us is that it is possible to curse somebody by cursing their son, which is something that you had sort of mentioned earlier on, that the curse that's happening here is a curse against Ham. It's just being directed at Canaan, which the rabbis are going to have to then try to unpack. But this does go into the more ancient way of looking at communities and families, which was you're a unit. And if one person in the family has done something wrong and another person gets hurt, that means the unit has had the justice against it perfectly balanced. The idea that there's a fully autonomous individual and another fully autonomous individual is a very, very modern concept. There were different degrees of autonomy, certainly, and individual responsibility for each other, but that there would be some overlap. Absolutely, there was an understanding that was there. The entire book of Job, in fact, is predicated on the idea that when Job lost his family and he lost everything else around him, that was against him. No one said it was against your kids. It was you, Job, must have done something wrong because your kids died, not they must have done something wrong. So at least within the text itself, obviously additional commentary, we can study Job another time. All right.
Okay, so because the curse is coming up, that's why specifically back in verse 18, we say the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Ham being the father of Canaan, and they don't tell us the names of the other grandchildren.
Because they're not going to be relevant to this story.
But this
Ham isn't the oldest, right? He's the second.
He is not. He seems to be the middle child. Seems to be, yeah. At least in the order that we have them laid out.
So why didn't he curse Shem?
And not only that, but Canaan wasn't the oldest child, right? Canaan was number 4, and we are going to get to exactly that answer in a couple of our midrashim of why was Canaan picked. And one, we're going to have an explanation that, well, he did something, and 2, we're going to have an explanation that it was fitting to the true crime, which we haven't even gotten to.
Well, the crime of the Ham runs in and sees his father naked. Oh, look, Dad's naked. He runs out and tells his brother, come look at Dad. He's laying there naked.
Right.
That was his.
But what about Canaan? Well, actually, that isn't. Actually, we're going to find out the rabbis did not consider that to be they did not consider that to be a proportional sin to the crime, to the punishment that Noah levels against them, which means they are going to find a much larger sin took place.
Because otherwise the other 2 brothers said, oh, we can't do that. And they turn their backs and they put the cloth on their father so they don't see him naked.
Right. So let's keep reading.
Yes, oh my gosh. Wow.
So
Canaan was infamous for his wickedness, and Ham was similar in character. Thus, he was the father of Canaan in the spiritual as well as the biological sense.
All right, so Sforno, late Middle Ages commentator, a little bit more modern in way of writing, says the reason why Canaan was picked was because Canaan was like his dad, right? The other kids, Mitzrayim, Cush, etc., they were not as spiritually deficient as Canaan was. And of course, we know that Canaan was spiritually deficient because look at the Canaanites. Right? There's an idea here of you look at the ultimate history of this nation to understand what the book of Noah is trying to describe about these people. So that's Forno's idea. So yeah, Canaan was exactly the right person because he agreed in every way with what Ham was doing. Or he may be even reading backwards that if the Canaanites were horrible, then Ham must have been like that too because, that was their father. All right, onward to Midrash Tanhuma.
And it says the sons who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Was Shem the eldest of Noah's sons, that his name is mentioned first? Is it not written Japheth was the eldest?
Which is implied in other texts, yes.
Why then was Shem mentioned first? Because he was considered to be more righteous and perfect by his creator.
All right, so the idea that these kids were being judged, and they're being judged as the progenitors of these new nations, seems to be agreed with other commentary. So the idea that Ham and Canaan are being judged as nations, not only as individuals, does seem to be consonant. And if I want to alarm you, this does also seem very similar to the question of their stock, right? Like we had our good friend, the preacher, talking about a nation's character is down to its stock, right? Where did it come from? The Canaanites we know are bad because look at what Ham did. Right? The Egyptians are bad because look what Ham did. Right? They came from Ham. Of course, they're bad people. Right? There does seem to be a little bit of an interplay with that. Now, whether or not this biblical text was meant to be taken as a full genealogical, literal understanding of the nature of the nations due to their biological connection, or whether this was trying to categorize nations precisely because of their spiritual connection, which had nothing to do with biology, is a very interesting discussion that we won't be able to get into, really. But there are some that argue that the way these nations are grouped have some geographic bearing, but given that most of these nations do not seem to have a common ancestry in any biological sense, we could probably be better served by trying to read these as being in the time that the Torah was being written down for the Israelites. These nations were confederations of like-minded nations that had similar traits that had nothing to do with their biology or even their history, but simply they had all reached those points independently of idol worship and immorality on a grand scale. But like I said, that's a whole nother argument. Let's get back to what did Ham do that really made Noah so upset? And this, we're going to go into the Talmud, as I mentioned just as we were beginning, or before we began. You'll see some words in bold, some words in light. The bold are more direct translations from the Talmud. The lighter words are the interjections by the translator to make them into English sentences.
And I wonder if anybody ever followed that preacher's children to find out what they did.
How far they fell from that tree?
How far they fell. Yes. Rav and Shmuel argue. One says he castrated, and one says he sodomized him.
All right, so what did Ham do?
I mean, this is by looking at their father. Well, we saw that they looked at him.
No. Ham,
No.
the first guy who walked in,
The first guy.
right, and who revealed his nakedness, right? So they said he didn't just look at his father dead. He either castrated him or he sodomized him, right, in his drunken stupor. So let's go ahead and see how that goes. Okay.
The one who says he castrated, since he injured with respect to a fourth son, therefore Noah cursed him by means of a fourth son.
All right, so if we have Japhet, Ham, and Shem,
Right.
that means Noah had 3 sons.
Right.
If Noah was going to have more children after the ark, that would have been a number 4 son. If you remove his ability to have more children, then you have basically preemptively killed a 4th son. And who got targeted by the curse? The 4th son of Ham. Remember, we saw in chapter 10, verse 6, the descendants of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Since Ham got rid of the option of a 4th son for Noah, Noah got targeted the curse on the 4th son of Ham. You following that?
But that's secondary logic.
Okay.
What's the logic that stands behind the castration?
Well, the logic is, why would you target son number 4?
That's how they got to.
Because if you target son number 4 for the punishment, then the crime must have been committed to the 4th son of Noah. Since Noah doesn't have a 4th son, the only crime that can be committed against his 4th son was preventing the 4th son from existing. Okay, so is this airtight logic? No. Is this, however, the sages saying what Noah explodes with as his condemnation
Looking for a reason.
seems a lot more disproportionate than just your kid saw you naked. And the idea that how did Noah know what had happened? Remember, you all picked up on that. Noah woke up, he knew what had happened, and he got angry. Well, if all that happened was somebody saw him naked, that doesn't leave like little eye prints all over your body. But if what happened was the removal of son number 4 preemptively, then yeah, you'd wake up and you'd know that. That would be very obvious to you.
Well, it says he learned what his son had done to him.
It does not actually say learn in the Hebrew.
What's the soul?
Vayeda. Right. Is it saw or knew?
It became known.
Vayeda. Right.
Yeah, so he knew.
Right.
He knew.
So maybe his other sons told him.
So I'm not saying it's the only way to translate, but learn is already taking one interpretation, but it could be that he simply knew directly. All right. So that's the argument for castration. But there's another point of view, which could have been, no, he didn't castrate him, he sodomized him.
And the one who says he sodomized learned this from, and he saw, and he saw.
Okay, great.
Twice.
What does that mean? So this is what's called a gezerah shava. In rabbinic literature and interpretation, if you have two words that are used in the same form in similar ways in different locations, then you can infer from the details of one to the details of the other. Even if they're not added, even if those details are not explicitly present in one case. So he's going to set up it means this over here, so it probably means that over here too. So if you could go ahead and see how this unfolds.
Here it is written, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. And there it is written, and Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her.
That's Dinah.
And he took her and lay with her and afflicted her.
All right, so if seeing her means he then raped her, then seeing him in his nakedness, and then he raped his father. Finding it a bit of a stretch?
A bit of a yes.
I have a problem with Talmudic logic.
Okay. So
Okay.
this is now an argument of which one that he did. Notice no one is saying he didn't do either. He definitely did something, and it was definitely monumental, but which one of these monumental things? Well, it's okay. They're going to try and explain how each of them can actually fit together.
Granted, according to the one who says he castrated, it explains why he cursed by means of the fourth son.
Right? That's what we said. If you say castration, then you explain why Canaan got targeted, because Canaan was the fourth son. But
according to the one who says he sodomized him, what is the difference? The fourth son. He should have cursed Ham directly.
okay, so again, the point we've all been raising, which is if you don't say that there was castration, if you say it was only, in quote, sodomy, then why would Canaan be the one who's the target? It should have been only Ham that was targeted. And therefore, the castration seems to be one up on logically explaining the rest of the text.
So this sage explains that both this offense and that offense were committed.
Right. They both agree that there was castration. The only thing they're arguing about was there also sodomy, right? Was there also rape?
These Talmudic scholars knew about Occam's razor.
Of course they did.
Of course they did. The simplest explanation is the best explanation. It accounts for all facts. So why is someone not saying?
Where's the kid in the back of the room going, excuse me?
The other two sons told Noah what happened. Noah got really upset because Ham should have covered him first and not run out and told the other two to increase the embarrassment. So where's that argument?
Oh, well, where does it say that he ran out to increase the embarrassment?
Well, he ran out
I'm
to tell
giving you
them.
an explanation.
Right.
No, I'm giving you my explanation.
Right. So I think
So
what's
my question
right.
is, why is that not taken on by the Talmudic scholars?
Right. Proportionality is the main thing, as well as the fact that simply accidentally seeing your father naked is not a sin. Right? It was not unusual for people to go to the bathhouse together with their like gendered family members. So and to see each other unclothed. You didn't go with opposite gendered people. It's not like a Swedish sauna or something. But you did absolutely see each other naked at multiple times. So why was this such a huge problem? And the fact that the Torah might have an ellipse, that the Torah may not overtly describe the horrificness of what happened here, is not that unprecedented. We know that in the discussion of Reuben and his father's concubine, it also seems more than just he moved his dad's couch. There seems to have been an implication of more impropriety in that activity.
I don't even see the implications. See, that's been the problem with my study of this verse
Right.
for 10 years. Yeah.
Right. So
I still haven't gotten the answer that I'm looking for.
Erva. The word erva, which means literally nakedness, is a sexually loaded term. When it talks about revealing the nakedness of relatives throughout the rest of the Bible, it is always interpreted as meaning having sex with them. Right? You should not sleep with your mother because it is your father's nakedness. Right? So that is where they believe that something licentious was going on here. And then once you get that idea that this usage of the term of nakedness and this disproportionality to something that's just not technically offensive or an offense in and of itself means there had to have been some other explanation for Noah's explosion. Now, our modern explanation might be, no, Noah was just upset. Right? You're right. He came in, he saw, he laughed, he joked about it with his brothers, and Noah went ballistic. And that is an explanation. But the rabbis were not content with that explanation because Noah being called, the righteous of his generation, they couldn't imagine that Noah would just have gotten upset at what had happened and go to such an extent as to curse one of his own grandsons into perpetual servitude, if that's even what it's actually talking about. So that's where the logic comes in. But you're right, it is not mathematical logic. This is not proving the hypotenuse. This is something that is absolutely open to argument and discussion.
Okay, this may be from left field, but if anything, there should have been something about the fact of drinking to the point of.
Oh, we're going to get to the drinking.
Oh, we're going to get.
We're going to get to the drinking.
Okay.
Yes, we will get to the drinking.
It's like you're
said, if nakedness wasn't so bad, how come the last parsha they were embarrassed and ashamed of their nakedness?
That's a good question. Did anyone tell them to be?
No.
Does that mean they were right to be embarrassed of their nakedness?
But it was linked to eating the fruit of knowledge of good and evil.
Correct.
So something between eating the fruit and being naked makes them embarrassed of it.
No. So the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of, eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil doesn't mean they actually know what is good and evil. It means they now decide for themselves what is good and evil rather than using God's benchmark. So what they ended up doing doesn't prove that they now know what is good and evil. It just proves they're making it up as they go along, which is really the rest of the Bible, right? Is humanity makes it up as it goes along rather than listening to God.
Then there should be some logic on why they thought being naked was bad then, obviously.
That's the conclusion that Adam and Eve came to, which is why God specifically says, who told you to do this? Right? God didn't show up and say, hey, you've learned to cover yourself. That's great. Now I can actually look at you. God shows up and says, why are you wearing clothes? Who told you this was a good thing or a bad thing or anything? There is a disconnect that now humanity is making up its own rules. And we may have embraced some of those rules, which is why I will always come to class clothed. But, but that doesn't mean that there is some inherent God-given demand that we all be clothed at all times. Some people have taken it that way, and that's a whole nother conversation. But that does not seem to have been the natural order of things. Just one last example, as someone who's in the Mishnah class, in Ketubot, we were talking about what happens if you get home with your bride and you discover that she has a rather unseemly blemish in her more hidden area that you would not have seen when you were doing your courtship. And the answer is, well, if there's a bathhouse in the town and your family's in town, then you already knew, because chances were someone had already seen her naked at the bathhouse and they would have told you about this. Right? Oh, by the way, do you know that she's got a third eye on the back? Someone would have mentioned that because they would have seen her naked and your relatives would have checked her out at the bath. So the idea people were looking at each other naked, and that was built into our legal principles of what was considered to be deceptive or not. So we may be a little bit more body shy. That doesn't mean they were. And like I said, other countries and cultures, even less. All right, onward, or we're never going to finish.
And he said, cursed be Canaan. Though Ham observed his father's nakedness, Canaan was cursed. Rav Judah said, inasmuch as a curse cannot prevail or a blessing has already been pronounced, and the Holy One, blessed be he, had already blessed Noah and his sons, because it said in Genesis 9, God blessed Noah and his sons. Canaan must have been born while they were in the ark.
right? So the idea is, if he'd already been blessed, then that means Canaan must have been outside that blessing. It was only the sons, and that means Ham now had the shield of blessing because God had blessed him. And God's not going to let Noah curse something that God has blessed. Right? Again, coming back to this idea, Noah is the one saying cursed, not God. So therefore, it seems like Ham was shielded from Noah's curse. But Canaan wasn't. He was outside of it because he was the grandson. He was the extra one born in the ark, which again, as we saw at the very beginning, it doesn't say they brought their kids in. It does say that they had kids during the ark, which, as we're going to see, was a problem in and of itself. Onward.
That Nehemiah held, Canaan had actually discovered Noah's nakedness and had informed his father, Ham, concerning it. Therefore, this curse was directed against the one who was responsible for the sin that was committed. And that's why it's written, cursed be Canaan.
All right, so he says, look, if Canaan's being cursed, he must have played a role, because we don't just curse random people. Again, showing that by the time of the Midrashic period, the rabbis were already more uncomfortable with children being punished because of things their parents had done. And so therefore, he wants to put Canaan as one of the actors into this drama. All right, onward again.
Our sages stated, when Noah was in the ark, he said to himself, would that my sons possessed slaves, so that they might remain seated while being served. When I depart from this place, I shall produce a descendant who will be their slave. So following this incident, he said to Ham, you prevented me from begetting a fourth son who would serve you. Therefore, your fourth son shall become a slave. And hence, he said, cursed be Canaan. This is the opinion of those who contend that Ham castrated his father.
All right, so again, coming back to our killing of number 4 preemptively, what do we think about Noah's contemplation?
What, did I wish my sons had?
Wouldn't it be nice if my kids had slaves? And since we're going to land, and the only people in the world are going to be my sons, I guess I'm going to have to make some slaves for them. I'm going to need a number 4, and then those kids can serve the first 3. Now, do you see any indication that this was considered a good idea? No.
No.
No, except for that preacher that you quoted.
Oh, yeah, except for the preacher. Exactly.
The guy on page one
He thinks it's perfectly normal and natural, and God wants people to have people waiting on them. But no, we don't see any indication that the rabbis are explaining that this was a good plan of Noah. What they are saying is that because this plan was in order or in action, it had been set in motion in Noah's mind, when number 4 was preemptively destroyed, that is why he cursed the way he did. Not that his plan was good, not that his curse was good, simply explaining why it would have been that he did what he did. Make sense? Okay, again, it's important when we read these texts that we have to be careful that we don't automatically think that just because it's put into the mouth of someone like Noah, that this is what the rabbis thought was a good idea. And as a matter of fact, there is an alternative version of that whole, I'm going to make another kid to be a slave for you guys, found in our next midrash.
Reb Barachia said, Noah was very distraught in the ark that he didn't have a young son to serve him.
Right, we know that having that young son was always considered to be a good thing. Most famous example, of course, being Jacob and Joseph and Benjamin. Right, the kids that were born last were the ones who were the biggest help to the dad because the others had, gone off and become their own families.
He said, when I get out, I will have a young child to serve me. When Ham did his act, Noah said, you prevented me from having a young child to serve me. Therefore, that man will be a slave to his brothers who are slaves to me. Rav Huna said, in the name of Rav Yosef, you prevented me from doing an act in the dark.
Meaning having sex.
Therefore, you will be ugly and darkened.
All right, so we'll get to that last line in just a second, but we have to deal with this other question. Now, this was a tricky one to translate because the word evet is slippery in Hebrew. It can mean servant and it can mean slave. Now, at the beginning, when he's talking about somebody helping him, he's not using the term evet. Right? He's saying someone lehishtamesh, to wait on me, right? To be like a shamish in the synagogue, right? To be a helper. And then after the act, this midrash switches from that term being an evet. So, and he calls his own son, meaning Shem and Yafet, also that they are avadim, that they are servants, slaves. I don't really know quite the right way to translate this, because the line between servant and slave is different. Because he certainly doesn't seem to be acting or treating Shem and Japhet as though they are going to be slaves to Noah for the rest of his life. So whether or not what we're talking about here when he says that you will be an Eved was intended to be the full perpetual bondage form, or whether this was meant to simply be you will be lower than, that you will be in a subservient, thank you, that's the word I was looking for, a subservient position to your brothers who are more dominant in some other way, it's hard to know exactly what was going on. And equally, it is hard to understand exactly what they mean by the you prevented me from doing the act in the dark, therefore you will be ugly and darkened. So first of all, who is that being aimed at? Who's the you of the target of that phrase? Ham. All right, again, we're back to Ham. You might immediately jump, which is what people did in the Middle Ages, to the idea that, see, that proves that being black is a curse. But who are the descendants of Ham? Chapter 10, verse 6. What? Canaanites, Egyptians, the Cushites we know, and Put, whatever they are. Right? So Put we can drop out because we have no way of knowing them. But that means 2/3 aren't dark. Right? 2/3 are not black in a literal sense, at least. Right? And even Cush, there's many varieties of darkness that come throughout the African continent. Yeah. And Cush is only one subset of the entire continent. So it might be quite problematic to say that when he says that you will be ugly and darkened, that means what we would recognize as a racial typing of being of African descent. Because it wouldn't apply to 2 of the 3 kids anyway. And yet that's what this Midrash seems to be trying to imply, that it would apply to Ham and therefore to all of Ham's children. So it's easy to jump to conclusions when they fit a narrative that we're used to. Whether it was a narrative like the preacher who was pro-slavery, or whether it's a narrative like many people are attuned to, which is anti-racism, which is not a bad narrative, but that doesn't mean that if you read something that hints in a way that a modern person might sound racist, that means that the antiquity was also being what we would recognize as being racist. There does not seem to be an implication throughout our text that somehow being black was wrong or a curse. Was it different from most people who lived in the land of Israel? Yes. Was it a curse? No. Because after all, who is one of the other people that show up and visit during King Solomon's time, very famously from the area? Sheba, right? And Sheba, if you look, I flip my page, if you're in chapter 10, right, and we're looking at verse 7, right, we see the descendants of Cush, and then we see the descendants of Ramah, and one of those is Sheba. Right? The queen of Sheba is one of the descendants of Cush, and she shows up and is given full honor and respect. And indeed, there's even discussion about whether or not there was some form of intimacy between her and Solomon, or perhaps even union of kingdoms. So it's not as though either the Bible or the rabbis had a problem with a particular skin color, but they did have a problem with particular spiritualities, right? And spiritual and moral codes. And so it's very important that we not read into it our template of language from the modern world. All right, we are way over time, so we're going to rush through the last few bits.
The sages taught 3 engaged in intercourse in the ark, and all of them were punished.
All right, now why is this considered a bad thing to be having sex in the ark? Because on the ark you are in crisis mode, there is limited resources, and the rabbis say that if there is a famine, you are not supposed to have children. Right? They normally say, be fruitful and might multiply, but not during a famine. That's just stupid, right? You don't have kids if there isn't enough food for them. And so too, on the ark, it was a lockdown. You were not supposed to be having kids during that time. And it was only, most people would argue, about a year between the beginning of the floods and the leaving of the ark. So come on, you can wait a year before you have another kid. But apparently 3 did not wait.
The 3 who engaged in intercourse were the dog, the raven, and Ham. The dog was punished in that it is bound.
Right? The dog is now domesticated. Right? And it does not seem like it should be a domesticated animal, but the dog is, right? Because the dog's that whole wolf, level going to it. It's not like a chicken or something.
It's not free.
Exactly.
The raven was punished in that it spits.
That I don't know enough about ravens. But apparently they thought the way ravens behave seemed to be nasty.
And Ham was afflicted in his skin.
Okay. And again, what does that mean? Now, in the Rashi from the 11th century says that he was black. But that does not mean that the Talmud says that he was black. It is it's unclear. There's definitely a tendency throughout human history that race has become more important rather than less over the span of human history. That people were aware and did not seem especially upset that people were of different racial typography or typology over the course of human history until much, much later, and beginning in the Middle Ages and then continuing more and more until you get to the scientific racism of the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's hard to know exactly what he means by this idea. And again, Ham, we're talking very specifically here about 3 or 4 different kids, only one of which we could say with any certainty would be black, and the others were of complexions that were absolutely similar to the Israelites themselves. Right? The Israelites were not walking around looking like little Nordic people. Right? They were definitely of a very similar skin complexion as the Egyptians or as the Canaanites. So to say that this is a racial punishment is very much reading backwards into what we have created as a racial animus in the modern world. All right, now let's just talk about wine, because this is a great quote from the Zohar, and I didn't want to go without mentioning the drunkenness.
And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard. In their comments on these words, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Jose greatly differed, one affirming Noah planted a vine taken from the Garden of Eden,
which is a good thing.
The other maintained he had plucked it by its roots before he entered the ark, and now planted it in suitable soil, after which it brought forth grapes, the juice of
grapes. That should be grapes. Yeah, sorry.
Brought forth grapes, the juice of which, after expressing, he drank and became intoxicated therewith.
All right, so either this was from the Garden of Eden, or he grabbed it at the very last minute because he was saving something from the sinful, horrible world that was about to be destroyed, that he was going to perpetuate on the other side of the flood. Right? You could not be more diametrically opposed in your understanding of what wine is. Right? Is wine a beautiful gift from God that allows us to have joy and to honor sacred moments? Or is wine something that makes you end up naked on the couch and embarrassing yourself in front of your family?
Yes, the answer is yes.
And the answer is yes.
Yes.
But the question is, what about Noah? What did he mean by it? All right, but that's sort of what they're fighting over.
So Rabbi Simeon said, in this verse is included a fragment of the hidden wisdom. When Noah, desirous of investigating into the cause of man's fall from his final state of holy innocence, not with the intention of imitating it, but of healing the sin of the world, he soon realized his inability to achieve his object.
All right, so the Zohar is just teasing out one concept that they use, which is very interesting. The Zohar introduces that sometimes you have to encounter a sin to fix it. That's what the Kabbalistic term tikkun olam means, and repair the world through that. And that means sometimes you have to do the sin. Now, there are some, like the Frankists, who took that to the extreme. I mean, it was basically, we have to heal the world by letting me sleep with your wife. And that was a huge, huge problem and heresy. But the idea that what was with this wine stuff that was causing all this trouble? I guess I should investigate to find if there is a way that I can redeem this as something that can be good for the world. And it was not perfect. He could not fix it so that wine would only be good, which means it's left to us to use wine or other alcohol in ways that are good and avoid the bad. There is no way to completely remove the possible negative consequences of alcoholic beverages. We have to be on guard. We have to be careful. There's no way to redeem it perfectly.
The tales of the Hasidim are sometimes you have to get muddy to help people out of the mud.
And apparently
so
sometimes
Noah wants to know what it's like to get drunk so we can be
Yeah,
helpful to these poor schleps.
right, and it doesn't work all that well. But which is a cautionary tale for the rest of us as well. So yes, there are parts of the Torah that are hard to understand and difficult, and there are words of our sages that can be difficult to understand and may even feel offensive to our modern sensibilities, and sometimes they are. Certainly many passages that deal with women, I absolutely agree, were meant in ways that we would consider offensive, and they are now offensive. But that doesn't mean that we should avoid studying them. It doesn't mean that we should cede that territory to those who would like to use them for the curse of Ham purposes. It means that we have to actually find which pieces we can redeem and need to be shown in their proper light so that the entire Torah is allowed to be studied and understood the way God wants us to, and to stand up to those who would abuse our beautiful tradition. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Listen,